Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. This evening I'm going to talk about the practice of Vipassana. As you know, there are two general categories of meditation that we talk about in our tradition, samatha and vipassana. Samatha is the meditation on a single object, and the idea is to develop samadhi and eventually to rest in jhana. And it's a very integral part of the path. Vipassana is considered to be the more difficult meditation, and it's really the royal road. It's the meditation that leads to a realization of nibbana, leads to awakening and the opening of the Dhamma eye, and eventually the putting down of the burden. When talking about Vipassana, an important point I think needs to be made at the outset, that Vipassana really, it's better thought of as a particular attitude or orientation of the mind, rather than as a specific meditation technique. There are several very skillful techniques that have been developed, particularly in Myanmar or Burma, for the development of Vipassana. And the one I'm particularly familiar with, that I was trained in, is the Mahasi method. So whatever I say will be bearing principally on that method, because I only know the other ones secondhand from reading or hearing, but not from actual practice. The attitude of mind of Vipassana is a way of holding the mind so that the objects of consciousness can be seen neutrally, without judgment, without discrimination or picking and choosing, without desiring or fearing or any reaction whatsoever, really. Ideally, the mind is just confronted with a stream of objects and knows them immediately without grasping. You sometimes hear the phrase letting go, and I think even that is a bit misleading, because letting go implies you've actually held it. The idea is to let the objects flow through the mind without any obstruction. And there are a number of components to this, and learning to do it properly is a skill or a knack that one acquires by practice. First of all, a good cardinal rule to remember is that nothing whatsoever is so trivial it can be ignored, and nothing whatsoever is so important it needs to be grasped. To treat every object with the same attention and non-attachment is Vipassana. A very important quality to be developed is upekkha, or equanimity. And this is a word with a lot of importance. It's a concept with a lot of importance in the Buddhist path. And it has different aspects depending on the context. But here, in terms of Vipassana, the type of upekkha that's being referenced is the specific neutrality. The Pali word is tatra majjhatthata. I think it was Bhikkhu Bodhi who came up with the translation specific neutrality, which is very good. It captures precisely both aspects of this mind state. The Pali, tatra majjhatthata, it's a compound and it breaks down to meaning the state of being in the middle about that. Tatra is that. It's a very emphatic pointing. So the two aspects are, number one, this neutrality, that one is neutral towards the object, but the second part is the specificity, that the mind is clearly aware of a specific discrete object and not a just general fuzzy awareness. Now, this is something to be cultivated, is this very sharp, quick noticing. Some people try and practice what I've heard called a choiceless awareness. It's a kind of meditation where it's a kind of undisciplined Vipassana. You just hold the mind in general awareness and try to be aware of what's happening. And it can feel good, and it's not without some benefit, but it only goes so far. It's not very progressive. It doesn't move the mind along because you're not noticing specific objects. Our ordinary consciousness stream, whether we're meditating or not, what we experience is in each moment an object arising to consciousness, and consciousness knowing the object. These arise pairwise, object and subject. And this is happening continuously, moment by moment. For the ordinary untrained mind, the process is not very clear or evident, and one can get easily bewildered and caught in various formations, become confused by the twin forces of either fear or fascination, desire or aversion. The mind is pulled and pushed by reaction to the objects. With Vipassana, we try and make the object discrete, clear, and objective. The objects can be any one of the 6 sense bases, or they can occur at any one of the 6 sense bases. It might be a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste, a touch, or a mental object. Amongst mental objects, there are a wide range of kinds. There is thought formation, there's emotion, there's memory, there's the feeling tone, there's perception, and many shades and nuances of all of these. So those are some kind of general principles. I think probably most of you have, or maybe all of you have had some introduction or instruction in the Mahasi method, but I'll go over it briefly to set a context. The way the meditation is done in the Mahasi method, beginning with the sitting posture, the mind is placed initially on the abdomen, that is the movement of the breath at the belly. And it's important for this exercise that the whole area of the stomach is taken, not a point. If you're using breath at the belly for developing samatha, you take a point. But here we want a diffuse object, because you don't want to get too far along in the jhana path. You want enough samadhi to make the mind lucid, but you want to still be able to investigate. So Mahasi Sayadaw wrote quite a bit about the reason he chose this base object, and it is a good one. And when you initially sit down, you place your mind there and watch the breath for anything from a few breaths up to a few minutes until you feel grounded and centered and ready to get deeper into the practice. Then you make a subtle shift in the mind, so you open the mind up to being aware of whatever else arises. And here's the key difference between Vipassana and Samatha. In Samatha, you practice non-attention to the objects other than the chosen object of the meditation. You disregard them. But with Vipassana, you allow them to be seen without grasping. And you learn this twofold knack of not missing anything and not holding anything. And all kinds of things impinge on the mind. Physical sensations, very often painful, but could be pleasurable. Mental states of all kinds. External things like sounds. Practiced properly, there are no distractions. Everything is just another object to be noticed. And the mind notices the object and doesn't hold it. Now, a particular method or technique of the Mahasi school is noting or labeling the object. So sometimes I've heard it called a noting practice. So when something arises in the mind, you make a brief, very light, subliminal mental label or note of it to classify it as remembering or hearing, feeling pain, whatever it might be. Now, it's important to understand the use and misuse of this labeling technique. It is entirely secondary to actually seeing the object. It's an auxiliary method. It's really like a trick you're playing on yourself to make sure you're actually seeing the objects and not missing anything, not letting anything slide. And on the one hand, it's really not critical how you label it. There's no real hard and fast right and wrong methods of noting. That's something some people get caught up in. They get lost in trying to figure out what was that, what should I label it. Just label it the first thing that comes to you. But having said that, you can develop some skill in noting. You can make it more productive for yourself if you follow some general guidelines. One is to try and use verbs instead of nouns. So it's always hearing and not sound. So you hear a bird singing outside, you don't mark that as bird. That's very crude. It's not breaking the experience down. There's hearing, and then if you recognize it as a bird, that's perceiving or recognizing. And then if you have a mental image of a bird, that's imagining, or you could even call that seeing. But you never actually experience a bird. Another rule is to keep the labels short. Don't make a story out of it. One, at most 2 words. You might say feeling pain or feeling pleasure, for example. Also, don't be too lazy with the labeling. Don't just label every mental event as thinking. Try and break it down a little bit. at least into past and future, so you distinguish between remembering and speculating or daydreaming. And what this does is to help to develop that specificity of noticing. So you're training yourself to notice discrete objects rather than a general gestalt of phenomena, but you're noticing the current moment, present object of consciousness as fine a grain as you can manage. In walking meditation, you practice very similar, except you don't use the foundational object. Is not the breath anymore, it's the sensation of walking on the soles of the feet. And when the mind is busy, you can stop and stand and just notice objects. So what we have here with this method of meditation, we could call it a disciplined kind of introspection. And we're trying to be aware of the process of objects arising to consciousness. One writer about the process of insight meditation coined a phrase that I find very good and useful, is that the meditation should be about process, not about content. Because the problem, many Western meditators, having been educated in a tradition of psychology and so forth, they tend to miss the main idea. They kind of go astray immediately, and they practice like self-analysis, psychoanalysis, rather than Vipassana. You're not trying to figure anything out. It's not an analytical kind of exercise. It's purely observational. You allow the object to exist in consciousness for a moment, you notice it, and you're ready for the next one. And what should happen with time is that you begin to notice more and more the characteristics of the object as being dukkha, anicca, anatta. Nothing dukkha, nothing is satisfying, nothing is complete or perfect. Everything is kind of provisional, dependent. Anicca, nothing persists for more than a moment. Everything is always breaking up and falling away. And anatta, everything is without a self essence. When the mind begins to wake up to these realities, in the words of Mahasi Sayadaw, you come to notice there is just the object, mind rising to the object, and no third besides, the third being the self. So there's nobody doing it. There's just an object and the knowing of the object. There's no agent or actor doing anything. And by making this process of the arising of objects and the taking of objects conscious, what we're doing in essence is observing samsaric becoming at the, you might say, the atomic level, at the very finest grain we can manage. We're seeing samsara in its nuts and bolts. This is how samsara works. And samsara is, in the last essence, it's something we do. It's something we choose moment by moment. We're choosing out of desire, second noble truth, we choose an object. We take an object. The mind craves to take an object. And the object is dukkha, first noble truth. Because of its inherently imperfect and incomplete nature, it's unable to satisfy the mind. So there's this sense left of wanting. The mind immediately wants another object to try and satisfy itself. And this is the primordial addiction. This is something we have all been doing constantly, moment by moment, for who knows how many lifetimes. It's an ancient primordial habit of mind. And all the different forms of existence and all the realms of existence are spun out of this process. But when you look at it at this fine-grained level, it starts to lose its magic charm. You no longer feel so bewitched by it. You begin to disengage. And the mind goes through various stages of reaching this point of disengagement. And this has been very elaborately written up, all the manual of insight of how the mind goes through 20 some odd stages from the beginning to reaching Nibbana. One of the important early stages is called the 10 corruptions of insight. This is the mind is gaining some power of meditation, and it has a number of jhana-like experiences, such as bright lights, or a feeling of ecstasy, the feeling of a complete well-being. It can be very pleasant, but they're called corruptions of insight because they're not corrupt in themselves, but the meditator will tend to attach to them. It's very common at this stage for a meditator to believe they've reached enlightenment and to have a false sense of completion, and they have not. And when the meditator sees through this, then it's called knowing what is path and not path. And one sees this too is impermanent, this too is suffering, this too is empty. And that stage is called knowledge of what is path and what is not path. And it's said that it's only at that stage that you really start doing Vipassana. Before that, you're just sort of working yourself up to it. But this is the real deal now. And eventually there's several more intermediate kind of developments of the mind. And the mind goes through some difficult passages here. As you begin to see the nature of samsara, the mind can feel miserable, fearful, despairing. What's happened is that the rose-colored glasses have come off. You're no longer able to fool yourself that samsara is some nice, pretty game. You see it as, horrible, falling apart, breaking up. Nothing can be relied on, nothing can be depended on. And that can be a very difficult passage for some people. And I think what's the most important requirement here is courage. That one has to just go on through. Just keep going forward. Because there's a tendency for some meditators to fall back, to take up again the illusions of samsara. And then they can prolong this process for a long time because they keep going like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Or you can go through it quite briefly by just ferociously noticing and not letting yourself be thrown. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel. When the mind finally reaches a stage where it develops a strong equanimity about reality. You say, yeah, everything is falling apart, everything is miserable, nothing is to be relied on here, but so what? I'm at peace. This is called equanimity about formations. And this is a very blessed stage. At this stage, you feel very peaceful. It's a pleasant abiding. It's not blissful or ecstatic, but it's like peaceful, pleasant. And the meditation proceeds by itself without effort. There's no longer any sense or feeling of putting in any work or effort, but you're flawless in your meditation. And according to Mahasi's writings, and borne out by numerous experience of numerous people, it's not possible to hold this state for longer than a few hours. Then one will fall back to a stage of restlessness, and then have to have the kind of unpleasant, restless experience for a little while and then get back in. But when you're in equanimity of formations, it is there possible to realize nibbana. It's not possible elsewhere. The mind has to be in that lucid, clear state, and there's nothing you can do here. There's nothing you can do to induce the experience. It just happens when it happens. The mind is becoming less and less attached to the phenomena, and eventually it does a kind of sideways shuffle, and it doesn't take an object. So when the mind doesn't take an object, what happens? It emerges from the conditioned and experiences the unconditioned. And this is the fruit of the path. This is the realization. This is the awakening, the knowing of the unconditioned. And the way we get there is by carefully attending to the conditioned until we lose the passion and interest in the condition. And the driving force brings us to taking objects, and coming into being at each moment falls away, and then the mind can slip free of the tether. So in this sense, nibbana is only ever one moment away. But in each moment we miss it because we're grasping for objects. And it takes this disciplined training to learn how to not do that. Essentially, you're learning how to not do something. It's not like you're learning to do something, you're learning to not do something. It's a very difficult thing. So I think I'll stop there, and we can have a tea and talk more informally.
Can you ask questions?
Yes, yeah, now's the time for questions. Maybe just wait, he's going to do the closing chant.
Andamayam Dhammakataya Sadukaram Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami